This is the last chapter for probability. I'm sure everybody's very happy about this. It's called Decision Making in the Context of Social Choices. It comes straight from the last lesson on voting procedures. So now we know about voting procedures, like all of them. When do we make them? So I'm going to talk to you about the advantages and disadvantages of each of the different voting procedures that we talked about in the last lesson. And we're going to talk about what makes a satisfied and a dissatisfied voter depending on the voting procedure that you picked. So let's talk about first just the pros and cons of all the different types of voting that we looked at. Majority and plurality. Here are some pros. They're simple and they can be implemented really quickly. And remember, majority and plurality usually deals with just like the number of votes, the greatest number of votes. The cons, though, is that they can lead to an election of a candidate who is disliked by a large part of the electorate, meaning, for example, it could be very tight and the person who wins might only win by 1 or 2 votes, but there is always going to be some voters who are not really happy, right? So I feel like that's one of the major cons of all of them across the board. But I feel like this is the only con for majority and plurality. So you just need to keep in mind the satisfied and dissatisfied voters. For Borda, Condorcet, elimination, and approval, there's pretty much the same pros and cons for all of these, so I'm putting them in one slide. Talking first about the pros, they allow for a more distinct interpretation of voting results, meaning that they're so specific that it really allows for a distinct interpretation in the sense where there's just a formula to them. And so that's what I mean by distinct interpretation. They also allow for the selection of candidates who will generally lead a high degree of satisfaction among the voters, among the people who are voting. Because there's such a formula or a rule that it's attributed to each one of these, we always, in these cases, want to have the most satisfied voters. And in this case, these 4 cases will give that. Some of the cons, pretty simple. They're complicated. They can be very complicated. You're talking about Borda and Condorcet in terms of the head-to-head and the points giving elimination where you have to get rid of one and give the points to the other. Approval is a little bit easier, but they are still pretty complicated and they're long to do. Any majority election, because if we're talking about certain of the voting procedures that we've looked at, for example, elimination, you need to have a majority vote. So here are the pros for any majority election. It's simple and not costly to implement. And it generally leads to a high degree of government accountability, meaning they are a majority government. That means that they have the majority of the seats, which means they have the majority of the votes. And so, therefore, whatever happens, we can, for lack of a better word, we can blame them for a lot of the things because it's a majority government in this case. Talking about the cons, though, it can generate many useless votes. If you're looking for a majority and so gets switched, talking about the elimination method, all those people who voted for the first choice, even though the first choice was, the least amount, all of them go to waste because then they go towards the second choice that those people didn't even vote for. It can generate a result that leaves many voters dissatisfied because, if you're thinking about majority and minority, it's one thing to have like a win, it's another thing to get a majority. But again, cons always deal with dissatisfied voters. There's always going to be a dissatisfied voter area for each of these voting procedures. And finally, it leads to a situation in which a party can win a majority of seats without receiving a majority of the votes and vice versa. So in this case, it does happen like that. We do see that perhaps they didn't receive all of the votes, but the way that it was brought out, they still won the majority under that voting procedure. Let's talk about finally proportional representation and some of its pros. If it's done properly, which we've talked about in class, it ensures that each vote counts and it counts fairly. It generates a distribution of power that fairly and accurately reflects to the will of the electorate. So in this case, what that means is that by to will of the electorate. It's because in this case, if you're voting for something for proportional representation, you can actually talk about it proportionally. The votes will be proportioned properly, that it will give that candidate, say, the right number of seats. Some of the cons, though, it often leads to a situation in which no party has a majority government, which happens. The need for coalitions, meaning like mini little groups of people teaming up together. So the need for coalitions among parties can then slow the decision-making process. So if you have a minority government, say, because of proportional representation, you're going to have little groups of people in the House coming together and saying, I'm going to vote for this if you vote for this, and so on. And so it's really more about teaming up with people as opposed to just a fair vote in the House. So I'm going to give you two examples. First example here, in a region comprising 10 districts of equal population, 10 seats must be attributed, one for each district. The following are the results. So here they are. As you can see, you have three parties, A, B, C, and D, and you have 10 districts, 10 seats. Okay, this works out well. If you look, each district has technically its own winner. But in total, you can see how much party A, B, and C gets from all of these districts. If we were going to talk about plurality in each district, you would see that A wins in 2 districts, so they would win 2 seats. B wins in 2 districts, so it wins 2 seats, and party C wins 6 seats because it wins in 6 districts. So if we talk about plurality, party C wins. But if we look here at the total, it has the fewest number of votes. So plurality may not be the best way to pick whoever wins in this case, but just to give you an example, if we did do plurality, C would win, but C didn't actually win most of the votes. If we talk about proportional, party A would win 38% of the seats because we're looking at the total now, and 38% of this whole of 10 is 40. Is 4. B would win 3 seats, and C would actually win 3 seats. So party A would lead the government and is in the minority, which definitely and most likely represents the voters, right? Because in this case, A got 38%. Not the majority, but did get the most votes, so it makes sense that it wins most of the seats. In my second example, I have the following are results of an election. So in this case, I got candidate A, B, and C, and those are the number of voters that voted for each of them. If we're talking about plurality, A wins, even though the majority of voters did not vote for this candidate. This leads to 28 very happy voters, 23 plus 12, not so satisfied voters. And so that's the case for this. But now these voters were asked then to rank the candidates in order of preference. So the next slide will show the results of doing that. So here are the number of voters who ranked the candidates in the order of first, second, and third choice. So 28 ABC, 23 BCA, 7 CBA, and 5 CAB. If we're talking about border count, candidate B would be elected, which leads to 23 very satisfied voters because 23 people voted for B first. But then we have 28 and 7 somewhat satisfied because they voted for B second. And you got 5 voters who are pretty dissatisfied. But if we're talking about satisfied versus dissatisfied voters, this is pretty, fair. And that is the end of voting procedures and the complete end of probability for this year. Up next, we're going to talk about financial mathematics.